Hello and welcome to today's satellite broadcast about climate change and what we can do in the health sector to reduce the risk of climate change. I'm very excited today to introduce our panel. I'm Linda Selvey, I'm Senior Director of Population Health and have been doing a number of presentations about climate change over the last year or so. To my right I have Patrick Maguire, who's Manager of the Carbon Management Unit within Health Services Purchasing and Logistics Branch. And Patrick's done a lot of really exciting things across Queensland Health to reduce our emissions. And on my left I have Dr. Amanda Lee, who is Head of Nutrition and Physical Activity for the Health Promotion Unit here at Queensland Health. And also, we're very proud to say, Chair of the NH&MRC Dietary Guidelines Committee that's currently reviewing the NH&MRC Dietary Guidelines. And Mandy just wanted me to just point out that she's not speaking on behalf of NH&MRC today, even though dietary guidelines will be mentioned in her presentation. So, first of all, what I was going to do is to give a bit of a broad background about climate change. Some of you may have seen one of my many presentations around Queensland Health. And what we'll be doing is a very small excerpt from that to just set the scene for the presentations from both Patrick and Amanda. So basically what I'm going to talk about is just a little bit about the greenhouse effect, point out that climate change is actually happening now and set a case for why we actually do need to take urgent action right away. So firstly about the greenhouse effect, which is basically what's necessary and enables planet Earth to be habitable. Because as the sun's rays come down and hit the Earth, first slide shows this, a large part of the solar radiation gets actually radiated back out into space in the form of infrared radiation. It's very hard to see on that screen possibly, but then some of that is reflected back to the Earth in the Earth's from the Earth's atmosphere. And carbon dioxide is one of the gases in the atmosphere that reflects this heat back, and it's simply a physical property of carbon dioxide that enables that to happen. But what that means is that means that we're able to live on planet Earth. It keeps our temperature at a habitable level. But what we're facing now though is an increase in carbon dioxide. What we're seeing as a result of that, a good example, an illustration of the existing warming that we're having is what's happening to our glaciers. And the next slide shows the Franz Joseph's Glacier, both in the late 1930s and in 2001. The slide actually does show it when we get to it. There's considerable retraction of the glacier in that time period. So another impact. What's happened to our slides? Sorry.
I haven't got the glacier.
Oh, that's a bit odd. There's no glacier slide. Anyway, I quite understand that. The next series of slides show the variation of temperature and carbon dioxide over a long period of time. Basically using ice core samples, it's been possible to actually take samples of gas that's been laid out in the ice core from a long period of time, back 650,000 years, and look at both the proportion of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and also the temperature at that time. So on the top you see the carbon dioxide concentration, and the bottom of that graph you see the temperature. Now there's a couple of things I want to really point out there. First of all is that over a period of time there has been quite a lot of fluctuation in both temperature and carbon dioxide. But I point out you may not be able to see the axis on the bottom, but each one of those ones with the numbers is 100,000 years. So that fluctuation that has happened with both temperature and carbon dioxide happened over a very long period of time. The other striking thing is the close correlation between carbon dioxide level and temperature. And this fluctuation, or this correlation, is what's called a coupled system. So it's believed that the main source of the change in temperature initially is the tilt of the Earth relative to the Sun. So as I said, this happens over a long period of time. But as the Earth tilts closer to the Sun, we get more radiation from the Sun, so it's heating up the Earth more. And then ice in tundra and so on melts and releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which then reflects more heat back to the Earth, therefore heating the Earth more. And then over again a long period of time, the Earth tilts away from the Sun again, and both the temperature and carbon dioxide levels fall. So, but what we are now seeing now is that the carbon dioxide level is now way higher than has ever been seen over that 650,000 years. So as you can see, it's considerably higher. And if we would continue our carbon dioxide emissions, the rate that we're currently doing, it would go almost off the screen, depending on what we actually do over the next few years to reduce our carbon dioxide emissions. So we're heading into territory where we really don't necessarily know what the outcomes are going to be, because we haven't actually had it in any kind of way that we can record in human history. 7 of the 10 hottest years on record have occurred since 2001. Now, it's been possible to record, or people have recorded temperature for the last couple of centuries. So we're talking about a relative small space of time, but it's quite extraordinary when we think of that 7 of the 10 hottest years occurred since 2001, and all of the 10 hottest years occurred since 2005. If we think about health effects, in 2003 there was a significant heat wave in Europe, and some of you may know that in France alone around 20,000 people died as a result of this heat wave. And this slide just reminds us that animals also are susceptible to heat stress, not just humans. And in Australia, one of a big impact of climate change is our natural disasters, which includes drought, floods and cyclones, which on that graph that showed earlier shows a very strong trending upwards in terms of our number of natural disasters. And they have been well documented by climate scientists as having a relationship with global warming as a result of carbon dioxide emissions. We have our Torres Strait in Queensland, where a number of people live on islands that are relatively low above sea level. And in 2005 there was a particular event where a combination of sea level rise that we have already seen, and globally that's around 23 centimetres, as well as particularly high king tides and a combination of winds that meant partial submersion of a couple of islands. And the picture that you have on the screen there is of Mare Island, and that submersion event obviously caused quite a bit of distress to the community, particularly as it affected the local cemetery. And something that's becoming of great attention recently is the drop in the sea ice and the polar ice cap. And this is something that's happening much faster than climate scientists or anybody would have predicted. NASA for the last 50 or so years has been able to actually estimate the coverage of the polar ice cap as in amount as a result of satellite imaging. And this graph shows the amount of annual sea ice measured at the end of summer. So it's measured in late September, which is the time when sea ice is at its lowest in the northern hemisphere. As you can see there had been a trend downwards in the amount of sea ice from when it was measured, and that's starting at 1980 there. And then a sudden drop between 2005, which was the previous record for the smallest amount of sea ice at that time, to 2007, a very dramatic drop that basically is a significant large area of sea ice. Now this has a couple of key areas of significance. It's of key significance to a number of the animals that live on the polar ice and rely on the ice to enable them to get from one place to another to get food. And we tend to think about polar bears in that scenario, but other animals such as walruses are also affected. Another important implication of this is that ice actually reflects sun and heat because it's white, and so when the ice melts you get more blue ocean, which absorbs more heat, which means then that it's actually contributing to the warming. And it's thought that maybe that's one of the reasons why the sea ice has actually dropped much faster than climate scientists would have otherwise predicted. So this is certainly something of great concern to us. We do work in the health sector, and it's important to think about the health effects of climate change, and particularly in the Australian context. And the way that I like to think about the health effects are both the direct effects of health effects of climate change, which relate to the increase in temperatures. So such things as heat stress, and I mentioned earlier about the situation in France. And basically this can manifest in terms of deaths, particularly people who are vulnerable, but also can affect people such as outside workers or people's ability to undertake physical activity and so on. Then there's a range of indirect health effects, such as on our food supply, which is certainly something that we're seeing globally, if not in Australia, as a result of droughts and now flooding in the United States. Also increased likelihood of foodborne disease and possibly vector-borne disease in Australia and certainly elsewhere in the world. And then there's a whole lot of other consequences that will occur as a result of the storms and the droughts and the economic impacts of climate change, which I think will end up being the most important health impacts, because we know these things actually have an enormous impact on our health. So direct impacts such as injuries, burning and drowning from the increase in natural disasters, the mental ill health and depression, which we have seen in drought-affected areas of Queensland and New South Wales, and social disruption. Now, just to set a bit more of a scene in terms of Mandy and Patrick's talks, Australia is actually per capita one of the highest emitters of carbon dioxide in the world, and this graph shows that the second bar on the left there is Australia. We're second only to the United States, with the orange bar next to Australia being the developed country average. So compared to the rest of the world, and even compared to the developed world, we emit a lot of carbon dioxide. Our emissions come from a range of sources, and the next graph shows our emissions. This is looking at across the whole of Australia now, not individuals' contribution to emissions, but from a range of industries across Australia. And of all our total emissions in Australia, 50% of our emissions come from electricity generation, largely because that's mainly sourced from coal-fired power stations. So what this means is that there's actually a lot of opportunity to reduce our emissions simply by looking at our electricity generation and our electricity usage. Also, almost about a quarter of our emissions come from our agricultural land use, and about 14% overall from our transport. And you'd expect probably in Australia transport to be high given the size of our continent. My final slide and my final point really is that the International Panel on Climate Change has indicated that global emissions must peak by 2015 at the latest in order to avoid dangerous levels of climate change. So as I've pointed out very briefly, climate change is already upon us. We're already seeing the impacts of climate change on a whole lot of areas. And when the International Panel on Climate Change talk about avoiding dangerous climate change, what they're talking about is getting our Earth system to a point where it becomes unstable and unpredictable results coming out as a result of that. So what they're saying is that if our emissions peak by 2015, it's likely that we will see about 2.5 degrees warming total, and that's not considered dangerous climate change, even though that will have a huge amount of effects. But dangerous climate change is warming at a much higher level, for which, as I said, there's likely to be very unpredictable consequences. So on the basis of that, given that we've got 7 years, what we can do in the health sector to reduce our carbon dioxide emissions and reduce the impact of climate change will be really, really important. So I'd now like to turn to Patrick Maguire, who's going to talk, as I said, about some of the really exciting things that he's been doing as part of Queensland Health's eco-efficiency program.
Thank you, Linda. I'll take this opportunity and I'll endeavour to provide you with the fundamental activities of the Carbon Management Unit, which is formerly the Eco-Efficiency Unit of Health Services Purchasing and Logistics. One of the drivers that's leading us to this initiative is through the announcement of the Climate Smart 2050 initiative announced in April 2007, the Premier has committed the Queensland Government to play its part in meeting the greenhouse gas emission reduction of 60% by 2050. Queensland Health, we have taken a very strong proactive role in our response to this challenge. And we've been proactive now on the heading towards abatement since 2004 with considerable success. The Queensland Government, if we go to the next slide, thanks. The Queensland Government endorsed the Strategic Energy Efficiency Policy in December 2007, which requires all government agencies within Queensland to develop a strategic energy management plan. This plan will have targets and timeframes for reduction of electricity usage and the resultant CO2 emission. We're required by 2010 to provide a 5% net reduction of our use of electricity across all our asset within Queensland Health, and by 2015, 20% reduction. Now this is going to be measured against a baseline of 2005, 2006, as it will provide us an active baseline to measure our success or failures across that parameter. It is then be proposed that each health service district prepare and submit individual management plans on energy. Probably those would remember it's not unlike the level 5 water restrictions in southeast Queensland when we all had to prepare a WEMP, which is a water efficiency management plan. We're going down the same track with energy. Hopefully we'll apply to that a scorecard that will measure the deliverables. We have further responsibilities, and our responsibilities are to enhance our assets by making sure our energy efficiencies are delivered and our service delivery outcomes, to ensure that we introduce conservation measures into our new as well as our refurbished buildings. Our procurement practices need addressing, and that'll be something we're heading towards now under the Health Services Purchasing and Logistics. It's one of the initiatives would be we go to the market at the end of this year for the purchase of our energy for all our contestable sites in the contestable market, which is something like 44 facilities, quite significant. We're looking at a component of green energy being part of that buy. We look to strive for our carbon neutrality of our supply chain to ensure that we're buying green and benefiting the environment to meet our targets. And of course, most importantly, we need to educate and train all our staff as to why we're doing it to deliver the outcomes required. The next slide is an actual fact, and it probably underlines why we're heading in this direction, because Queensland Health now occupies a position of 30% of use of electricity across the whole of Queensland Government, which is absolutely significant, and that alone should trigger the need for further reduction. The role of the Carbon Management Unit, we have a requirement to administer the Strategic Energy Efficiency Policy. We'll be there to assist any of the health service districts to roll out energy and water reduction initiatives. We hopefully will approach it so we can coordinate a consistent approach across all our facilities for energy and water management. And eventually, as we move towards our desired outcome, we'll have a broader environmental governance which will enhance all of these capabilities. And the unit itself is required to report annually to the Treasury, Queensland Treasury, through the Department of Public Works, the efforts and results driven by Queensland Health over that time frame. Now the scope of our efficiency program is fairly basic, and I reiterate what I've just previously said, but our prime agenda is to introduce energy conservation measures, reduce the demand on electricity, gas and water, and obviously the resultant greenhouse gas emissions. We're currently introducing renewable energies, which is important. We're also looking at purchasing green energy, as I previously said, and as part of our retrofit of significant hospital facilities, and at this point in time, 16 major hospitals have entered a performance contract to retrofit to reduce their emissions. We're looking as part of that to improve their building management system, which is a significant tool in the management of energy. We originally, when we started in 2004, we looked at a methodology. We did a very broad exploration of the marketplace to identify performance contracting was the tool we thought would be our preferred methodology to roll out the program across health facilities and our building portfolio. The reason for that was that the risk involved in the process is transferred across to the energy service company and not Queensland Health, which became a better business case for us. At the time, we needed to find out who had the capability, so we went to the market in 2004 and established a panel of energy service companies who have the capabilities of introducing conservation measures. We obviously had two main criteria to select the right players, and one was obviously they had to demonstrate previous experience in that environment, particularly in health, and two, they had a financial capability to sustain a financial guarantee under which the parameter was the contract. The ESCOs that we selected also have a role to play in this because it's a partnership between ourselves and the private sector. They were required to do a detailed facility study proposal on each of the facilities that were participating, and that aligns itself with the Australian standard on audits, on energy audits, which is a level 2, which provides a plus or minus 20% on our deliverables to measure, in fact, whether we should go forward with that particular facility. We had to require data from the facilities to arrive at the baseline to measure whether, in fact, these deliverables would be advantageous to Queensland Health and the environment. And the designing of the project, it was important that the districts participating partner with the ESCO and do a joint venture. Hence, it should have been done and will be done in consultation with the participating facility. We require a turnkey solution, which is walk in, walk out. We don't need any residual work left behind. It's a guarantee, and the guarantee has to be fulfilled. The energy contract, which is signed to engage the service companies, has a component for training and briefing of relevant personnel for the maintenance of this new equipment that's been introduced. We require a measurement and verification which is established as an international protocol now in energy efficiency as to validating the existing data and measure the success or failure 1 year after the final retrofit. And we needed a guarantee in writing as to what savings in kilowatt hours would be delivered by the energy service company. A business case was presented and we decided to go with the industry standard that we'd deliver and receive 12% or better return on our investment. And currently across the participating facilities, we're now arrived at a 16 to 17% return on our investment, which financially is quite significant. The funding for the retrofit for each of the facilities has been provided internally in Queensland Health by way of a post-budget adjustment, paid back out of the savings from the reduction in energy costs. And we have a letter from the Premier saying anyone who participates and makes savings can retain the savings. Some of the conservation measures, but not limited to, are lighting. We engage in a full retrofit of the lighting. We include the occupancy detectors and daylight sensors, and that obviously supplements our training programs and educational programs. The education for, we're pre-treating the air prior to its entry into the air conditioning by way of dehumidification, so there's less demand on the energy required to generate the air conditioning. We're looking at adjusting set points in areas that won't be adversely affected to reduce the demand on energy and reduction of CO2. And I mentioned before, the building management system is quite an integral component in the whole management of a facility, and we were looking at upgrading that with advanced features on the controls. Water harvesting becomes a component that we're very interested in. We've strategically placed tanks for harvesting around all our facilities, and we've now engaged in the recycling of the dialysis water through the reverse osmosis process. The hot water is another issue. The old hot water system now been replaced by the heat pumps, which now under the Office of the Renewable Energy Regulator in Canberra generate revenue if you participate in that activity. So we now trade in renewable energy certificates in the marketplace. We move on to the next one. It's purely a visionary item, but we elected to go down the track of putting 100 square metres of solar panels with parabolic collectors on a frame we constructed at Nambour Hospital and on top of the car park in Ipswich Hospital to generate hot water with free energy from the sun, which has made remarkable reduction in energy costs. Once again, the next slide is probably a little bit more specific. To give you an idea, we constructed that frame specifically to take the weight of those collectors, but it became a dual purpose where we provided car parking facilities underneath that to give them a bit of shade during the day, but it was a win-win situation for all those who participated in that project. Harvesting is still, again, just to give you an idea, that resides at Nambour Hospital. We strategically placed them around the premises to collect the rainwater to put through the cooling towers, which again is another saving. These are a bit of interesting facts coming up. Across the number of participating facilities to date, we're now saving in the vicinity of 48 million kilowatt hours annually. Now that's contracts exist for about 15 years, so the savings is significant, and the CO2 emission reduction that emanates out of that will be relevant too. There's 43,000 tonnes of CO2 emissions that we'll save out of the reduction in demand on energy, which to the layperson, if we wish to relate that to motor vehicles off the road in Queensland, that occupies a figure of 9,800 motor vehicles off the road annually, which is a mighty contribution for us as our corporate social responsibility. The Carbon Management Unit is in preparation of positioning Queensland Health for the introduction of the Australian Emission Trading Scheme in 2010 and the potential impact it might have through a cap and trade scheme. We're unsure at this stage, but we're not taking any chances. We're preparing because we believe the first sector will be the electricity generators, and during cap and trade they will probably have to pass their costs on to the end user, which again will be Queensland Health. Hence our drive to reduce the demand on energy is paramount. We're also currently negotiating with the Queensland Treasury Corp to establish a carbon footprint on one of our health facilities within close proximity to Brisbane, which will provide us with a template for the population of that document if and when the time comes at 210 for the emission trading scheme. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Patrick. So as you can see, within Queensland Health, it's certainly in terms of our large facilities, we're already doing quite a lot. And now we're going to take quite a different tack, really, because Amanda's going to talk about reducing carbon dioxide emissions amongst the population through how we can do that through our food, what we eat. So over to you, Mandy.
Okay. Thank you, Linda, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about this topic today. The focus of this satellite broadcast is really about what Queensland health practitioners can do around climate change. But in this area of food, nutrition and ecology, I think we're still at the stage that we all primarily need to increase our awareness about the issues. So I do want to take a little bit of time to talk about the interrelationships of food production, the environment and health, to look at overconsumption issues, which is probably the issue of familiarity given the obesity epidemic for our health staff in this area, to look at the impact of food processing, packaging and transport, and then some very practical suggestions about how we might be able to reduce our carbon dioxide emissions in this area. The basic facts of this issue, as we've heard very eloquently today, is that climate change is occurring now. The impact of food is that what we eat does affect climate change, but also the opposite occurs. Climate change will affect what we eat. So there's a very complex cycle of interaction that we need to consider. As well as environmental issues, health staff also are bound to consider equity issues, and these are also tied up when you start looking at the global impacts of food and the environment, and we'll talk about some examples of that as I go through the presentation. In terms of environment, what we mean in terms of food is that we need to consider the costs of production, processing, packaging, transport, storage and preparation of foods. And the ways that we can look at that is in terms of fossil fuel use, water use, land use, biodiversity and greenhouse gases. Linda's already explained that about a quarter of carbon dioxide and emissions and greenhouse gases come from the agricultural sector. So there's a lot to be gained from addressing this sector. If you look at the drivers on the production of carbon dioxide in this sector, basically they're all a result of growth of population, growth of demand in food, growth of demand to make profits from the sale of food. Even the population pressure in Australia has meant that agriculture is moving into more marginal areas, that we have then the increased use of fertilisers and irrigation, and increased demand on intensive animal husbandry approaches. We've got increasing monoculture, and I want to talk about this a little bit later in terms of the production of ethanol for fuel rather than food. I think that's a very salient point. But the downsides of this is, of course, increasing pollution, salinity of our waterways and salinity of our land, which is a particular problem in Australia. As the population grows, there's increasing demand for transport and distribution of food, and that leads to different drivers in terms of packaging and processing of foods. And interestingly, the population has an increasing demand for animal products, and I want to talk a lot about meat and meat production in this opportunity too. But the main point about all these drivers is that environmental costs are not factored into the product prices of our food, and basically the environmental and the health costs of the consequence of this overproduction and rapid growth are actually borne by the community and the health sector rather than by the broader food industry. The reason for this is when you look at the economic drivers in the area of food production, they're huge. Australian food exports earn $24 billion a year to the Australian economy. As you can see from this slide, most of our agricultural and horticultural products are actually exported from Australia. About 80% of our grains, sugar and oilseeds are exported, and even 50% of our milk and milk products. And the economic pressure is to keep producing and to increase these exports even further. Looking at the environmental impact of some of these commodity groups is really interesting. They can be categorised in terms of their effect on water, fossil energy, biodiversity or greenhouse gases. And it just shows how complex the considerations have to be in terms of making preferential assessments about appropriate diet. For example, fruit and vegetables have a very low to medium sources of greenhouse gas production, but they have incredibly high demand on our scarce water resources. Conversely, meat is one of the major producers of greenhouse gases within the agricultural sector. Up to 40% of that high emission rate of greenhouse gases comes from methane produced by cattle and other ruminants in Australia. So the interesting thing there, I think, is in terms of the assessments about the water use to produce the meat that we consume too. So I'd like to look a little bit more in detail of the litres of water used to produce kilograms of food in Australia. So the next slide shows, for example, that it takes about 2,000 litres of water to produce 1 kilogram of rice. This has been quite a topical issue in Australia for those who've been following the debate around the Murray-Darling water distribution system, and particularly the influences of Cubby Station and other large rice producing stations. But it's really interesting to observe that in fact in Australia the requirement of water to produce that amount of rice is actually less than in other countries such as Indonesia. The issue isn't so much the water use, but just the fact that in Australia the availability of water is severely compromised already. So it's probably better, one could ask, to purchase rice from Indonesia, where there's also mixed use and subsistence production of that rice, than to continue to produce it in Australia. And there's a lot of discussion around the ethics of that issue at the moment. If we could go back to that slide, a really interesting assessment is the different estimations of the amount of water used to produce beef. Internationally, it's been estimated that 100,000 litres of water are used to produce 1 kilogram of beef when it's produced in a lot feed intensive farming system. Estimations for Australian range cattle really were made by CSIRO, about half that at 50,000 litres of water per kilogram of meat. But more recently, and I think this is interesting, the meat and livestock industry and associated environmental scientists have come up with figures that are less than 1/100th of that estimation. So I do want to draw people's attention to the fact that all these sciences are quite new, and it's very important to look at the sources of the information that we're trying to compare and the methodology that's used to produce these figures. To just look at that question of food or fuel for a minute, it takes about 11 acres of corn to produce the ethanol required for one car for 1 year. But it's important to realise that that amount of acres of corn can feed 7 people in a year. And globally, this is really brought into play when you consider that the amount of corn used for ethanol in the US in 2004 could have, just for ethanol, could have fed 100 million people around the globe. So again, the complexities of what looks like simplistic solutions to environmental issues need to be really considered. In terms of common understandings within the health system, overconsumption is an area that we're used to dealing with. The current rates of overweight and obesity amongst Queensland adults are 70% for Queensland men, 55% for Queensland women, and 21% of our children are overweight or obese. We have about 1/3 of early deaths in Queensland that can be prevented, and that poor nutrition contributes approximately 16% of the burden of disease, that only 15% of that population bear 85% of the burden of disease in our system. So there's equity issues there. But this whole overconsumption is one of the main impacts on our climate and on our agricultural systems in Australia, but it's also causing pressure on our ill health system and on the need for acute hospital beds. If you look further at what foods Australians are currently over-consuming, the next slide shows the difference in the consumption of boys from 1985 to 1995, and there was a 15% increase in energy intake of our boys 11 to 15 years old in that time, of which most came from carbohydrate and carbohydrate containing foods. And these, for the first time, we understood that this was pizzas, hamburgers, soft drinks, cakes, biscuits, sweets, the sorts of foods that are very energy dense, but unfortunately people are eating not so much more energy dense food, that's the amount of energy per unit of that food, but also eating more amounts of those foods. There's an increasing reliance on animal foods, decreasing consumption of plant foods, and increasing use of processed foods, all of which contribute to that drive for changes in the agricultural system. To look further at the changes in meat consumption, globally there's been a 50% increase in the amount of meat consumed throughout the world in the last 25 years. But there's huge inequities around the consumption of meat. The next slide shows that North America consumes about 123 kilograms per person per year of meat, and the lowest intake is in Africa, which has only got 15 kilograms per person per year. Australia is in that red line down the bottom, where we're consuming about 69 kilograms per person per year. Why this slide is important is because of those vertical lines. The left line is one from the International Climate Change Committee, which represents a recommendation for climate control of only 32.85 kilograms per person per year. The line on the right is that recently released by the World Cancer Research Fund. These two lines are very similar to the current recommendations by the ACHSE for meat intake in Australia. We have an intake about 40% above the recommendation. So I think it's fortuitous that the recommendations for climate control are very similar to the recommendations for health, and that makes it a lot easier in terms of making a decision around where we should be aiming at for meat consumption in Australia. It's interesting to look also at the kilojoules required to process food, because this is a direct corollary of the greenhouse emissions in producing that food. There's always some surprises when I show people this slide. For example, it takes only about 6,000 kilojoules to produce 1 litre of soft drink, but it takes 25,000 kilojoules to produce 1 litre of diet soft drink. So here's an example where we don't have synergy between a health driver and a greenhouse driver, if you like. The foods that are most highly processed, of course, take the highest kilojoules. And here we do have some corollaries. For example, chocolate is one of the most energy-dense consuming and energy-dense producing foods. So perhaps we need to go a little bit lower on our chocolate intake. But you can see there it's not direct, because instant coffee also is very, very high. If you look at another problem with food production, that's packaging. In Australia, 1 kilogram of landfill waste basically produces 1 kilogram of greenhouse gases. About 40 to 50% of Australian landfill comes from food and garden waste, and that is a total of 8.4 million tonnes a year. There's also 3.3 million tonnes of packaging per year produced in Australia. It contributes to about 72% of our litter. A very topical issue has been that of plastic bags. In Australia, we go through 25 million plastic bags a year, and about 65% of these are used in food and beverage packaging and handling. Another critical issue is the number of plastic bottles used to transport beverages. Globally, there's 400 billion plastic bottles produced every year. If we could look at the issue of bottled water a bit more closely, there's actually an issue here of direct relevance to Queensland health. Australia spent $385 million on bottled water in 2006. We consumed 250 megalitres. And this is in a country that has a very safe water supply from our tap. To produce that water in 2006 cost 50 million litres of oil. There was 20% extra energy requirement used in transport too. So enormous amount of energy going into bottled water. It's important perhaps to look at this another way. For example, every litre of domestic bottled water takes 3 litres of water to produce. If we import our water, every litre of imported water takes 6.7 litres of water to produce. But only 35% of those water bottles are recycled. Drinking tap water costs $1.20 per tonne, but at the moment Australians are increasingly paying for bottled water, which costs $3,000 per tonne. So there seems to be some economic imperatives there too to go back to the tap. The question has been raised recently about whether Queensland Health should change to bottled water. If we provided each inpatient with 1 litre of bottled water per day, which is quite conservative for their fluid needs, the estimated cost to Queensland Health would be $3.8 million per annum just in our health facilities. But importantly, the concern would be that this would create 24,000 cubic metres of plastic bottles for recycling every year. So we're going to have to develop huge recycling centres to cope with that demand. To just go back very quickly to look at foods, The issue here is one of the argument around the drivers for food supply in our system are one of providing choice, individual choice. But we know from the literature that providing choice actually increases variety, which drives increased consumption. And I'd like to just point the questions about whether Australians really need the 30,000 food types that are currently available in our supermarkets, and whether we really need a choice of snack foods of 1,800 different types of snack foods in our food supply. We've really lost that ability to eat seasonally. We know that when people are exposed to seasonal food, they have an increased understanding of food literacy. But in Australia, the demand for food is driving such decisions as the import of Valencia oranges from the United States in winter, even though we have good quality supply of navel oranges here in Australia. So the question is, do we really need two sorts of oranges? Can we just live with the navel ones and save all that transport energy cost? Food miles is a really interesting topic that's got a lot of coverage recently, but the issue isn't really as simple as it first appears, because as well as the distance that the food travels to market, we also need to consider issues such as the sustainable production, the amount of water that's used in the production of the food, as I've talked about earlier, and also equity issues. For example, some New Zealand produce uses far less chemical fertilisers and water than we do in Australia. So the equation around the energy costs in transporting the food here can be quite equivocal. Just want to finalise by just raising this point, I think has been stated by other presenters today. While these considerations are quite novel and we're all starting to grapple with these issues from a health perspective, the worry is that in fact we're already seeing the impacts of unsustainable food systems throughout the globe. 20% of the world population already doesn't have enough to eat. Every night we're hearing about the effect of increasing food prices, particularly of healthy food, even here in Australia. In Queensland, we've been looking at the price and availability of healthy foods throughout the state since 1998. And we know that there's been a dramatic increase since about 2000, and the healthy foods such as fruits and vegetables have increased substantially over the less healthy alternatives and the most highly processed, therefore the most greenhouse gas producing foods in our environment. We're already seeing the effects of environmental degradation. We're already seeing decreasing productivity. And we're already seeing health and social justice issues arise as a result of this. For example, the gains that we've been seeing is a result of the Go for 2 and 5 fruit and vegetable marketing, social marketing projects throughout the state are really at risk. Our latest results from low income groups around the state show that their consumption of fruit and vegetable, which had increased, is starting to fall back. And the main reason for this is the increasing price of these foods, particularly fruits. Okay, so the issue is, what can health workers do? We can increase the awareness of the issues, but we need to check the data. We need to keep working to decrease overconsumption. We need to promote foods and drinks with less packaging. We need to consider the promotion of local and seasonal products, even considerations of shopping locally for foods in season and using farmers markets. Some people say we should go as far as growing our own veggies and fruit trees as an example, and keeping our own chooks. We need to use and promote and support recycling. We should be participating in the current NHMRC dietary guidelines, which will be considering environmental as well as equity issues in the recommendations that are made. and in true public health style, look at forming partnerships with organisations working towards sustainable food systems. In terms of broader government involvement, disseminating accurate information around sustainability is important. Increased awareness in the community of the problems of excess, both health and environmental, and expanding and improving recycle systems. There's current debate around things like pricing structures, and we've already talked about promoting dietary guidelines. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mandy. And I have to say I was a bit devastated about the chocolate. One of my little weaknesses. Anyway, we've got about 8 minutes left, and we'd be very keen to hear from people any questions that you have. I'd certainly, in going around doing these climate change presentations, I've found that people are very keen to think about what they can do, and particularly in the workplace. Just before we move to the workplace, I'd just like to say that each one of us, as Mandy's talked about in terms of food, are producers of carbon dioxide. I showed you that pie graph earlier about carbon dioxide emissions across the country, and if you look at it at an individual level, it's quite interesting because around 28% of our total emissions as an individual is through our food use. Around 20% is our household energy, most of which is actually electricity, and around 10% is our transport. And there's that other the green area there, as you can see on the screen, our goods and services. So our overall consumption of a whole lot of things, clothes, shoes, whatever, also contributes carbon dioxide, and I think Mandy illustrated that pretty well in her food example. So if you have any questions, I'd really encourage you to ring them through, and the number to call is 3234 1905. That's 3234 1905. We actually had somebody fax through some questions, and I thought I'd kick off with one of those. And one of the questions that has come through is, would Queensland Health consider creating a volunteer environmental officer / rep for each floor and department to help increase awareness and encourage carbon dioxide emissions? What do you think about that, Patrick?
I believe there's something in place now through the union with carbon champions that we're located, a number of them across the state. So that could be a vehicle for driving that agenda.
Yeah, thanks. I actually think that's a really good example, good idea. And within population health, there's certainly a lot of desire to look at our own carbon dioxide emissions and where we work across the population health function, and a recognition that in spite of the fact that I've been a champion of climate change for many years, we haven't really looked at it. So I think that there's lots of opportunities beyond the big districts to actually do some of the work around reducing our emissions. I'll just give you that number again. It's 3234 1905. One of the things that I've found in going around doing these presentations, Patrick, and also from an email that I got, is that individuals often come up with really good ideas about how it might be able to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, and some of them have actually championed this. For example, one of our staff members has been championing the idea of, instead of our computers going to screensavers, they're actually switching off the monitor. And he's estimated the amount of carbon dioxide that would be reduced and electricity saved. People often find that they come across barriers in trying to introduce these things that could be systematically applied across all of Queensland Health. What would be your advice, Patrick, for individuals who've got these great ideas and how they might actually get some traction?
Contact the carbon management unit and use us as the vehicle to deliver that. Just for information, we are currently talking to the IT to see what we can do to resolve that matter. So it looks pretty positive.
That'd be great. I mean, a lot of these solutions are relatively painless because we don't actually see much difference for ourselves. It's about setting in place the systems, and I'm sure that's been the experience in the districts. Some of what Mandy's been talking about really might potentially have an impact on, how, people's perceived enjoyment of life or whatever, but I think Mandy's also shown a very strong link between, the environmental impacts of consumption and also the health benefits. Another question that was faxed through, I'll just give that number again though, because I'd love for people to call, 3234 1905. But the question was, would Queensland Health consider including a climate change section in the mandatory induction training for all new Queensland Health employees, such as talking about policies to reduce our carbon footprint through recycling and water use?
I think it's a great idea. I think we can all learn from a process like that to highlight what we need to do and why we're doing it, and not just leave it and hope that people can identify that in their own vein. We have special needs, special requirements. We have a social obligation to do that, so I think it's a great idea, and we would drive an agenda and prepare something to do that if we can get the concurrence from our HR.
Well, there's certainly, I think that's probably, you know, we've got this fantastic carbon management unit, and there's a lot of interest in the whole idea about reducing our emissions, and I think what I'm kind of sensing around the place as I travel around talking to people is there's a desire to pull it together somehow in an overarching kind of view that would then, you could look at things like HR and a whole lot of other places where we might be able to have an impact. And certainly if people are interested in that and influencing that, please get in touch with us. There's some information there about the Carbon Management Unit now currently on the screen, the QEP's intranet site and our internet site. So I'm sure that through that site you'll be able to get hold of Patrick, and I'm also available on GroupWise.
Just to support that, we are currently working with Public Affairs to produce a document identifying what people can do at home and what they can do at work to protect the environment. So that's currently underway. In the not too distant future, we'll have that circulated around Queensland Health. Thank
you, Patrick. That's fantastic. We're getting almost close to finishing, and I guess, given as chair, I feel like I get to have the last word. And one of the things that, as health professionals in particular, we really can do a lot of that is very effective, and that is spreading the word. We are at a fairly critical time. As I pointed out, the International Panel on Climate Change have said that our emissions must peak globally by 2015 at the latest. And we're also at a critical time in terms of a lot of government decisions, such as through our carbon trading schemes and so on, key decisions both at Australian level and internationally in terms of making the next decision about the post-Kyoto agreements, etc. So spreading the word is a really, really critical thing, and I really welcome ACHSE's initiative in putting this satellite broadcast together as part of that overall picture of spreading the word. There's plenty of information available on websites. I'm happy to go and talk to people, or I'm sure there's lots of other people who can talk about the issue that will assist you in spreading the word, writing to your politicians, letting people know that you care about this issue. And thank you very much for your attendance, and especially thanks to Patrick Maguire from the Carbon Management Unit and Dr. Amanda Lee from the Health Promotion Unit, who I'm sure have provided you with a very interesting presentation today and plenty of food for thought.